Let's talk about Supercross 450 setups, and today we're going to be going through 3 different bikes: the KTM, the Beta, and the Husky. And I kind of have a reasoning behind all 3 bikes and why I use all 3 bikes at different times. Starting off with the KTM here, I really like to run the 120 rear tire. Just seems to be what I go to. I know a lot of people like the 110, and I do run the 110 on the Beta sometimes. I don't know, I kind of go back and forth. I haven't really locked it down. It feels like sometimes when I first get on a track, I'll go to the 120, and then once I get comfortable and kind of understand the lines and throttle control and all that, I'll go back to the 110, but I kind of hop back and forth all the time. It's important for me to note that under suspension here, all of these setups that I'll be mentioning today are all basically started with Doug's setups, and I've tweaked them a little bit. I will put Doug's, all of his setups are free, by the way. I'll put his Discord down in the description. And yeah, anyway, we went a bit stiffer in the front on this bike and a bit softer in the rear. This is probably the most planted and like straight shooter through the whoops of any of these 3 bikes. If you can get on top of the whoops, it almost feels like the front end is just dead. It just skims right through them. It may not be the fastest, but that's the reason I'm showing the KTM here, is because this is the bike that I'm the most consistent on. I feel like I can click off the closest amount of lap times and laps on this thing over and over and over and over again. It is definitely not the fastest bike, or the bike I can go the fastest on. For instance, yesterday we did Anaheim 2 qualifying. Just before practice, I did a 1 minute 0.2 on the Beta. I switched to the KTM to see how it was in E-Road, and I was going to qualify on the Beta and then race the KTM. I went into qualifying and I forgot to change to the Beta, and I just was doing something and clicked on the KTM, and I sweat my life away in that qualifying session. I could only do a 101.2. I immediately closed out of qualifying, jumped on the Beta, and within 3 laps, I ran a 1 minute 0.5, which would have qualified me pretty high up. The Beta is just fast in 1 lap, but the Beta is also just kind of mid you'll see. I'll explain later. Moving on to drivetrain with KTM, some changes here. I made my 3rd gear a little shorter and my 4th gear quite a bit longer. This is specifically for the whoops, and then we're running 1349. Here's the geometry changes. Of course, you have to run green race mapping now, but everything else is pretty much just makes the bike really, really stable, and it still turns really good. Now, let's move on to the Beta. All right, so the Beta is insanely good for hot laps, and probably my favorite bike if I'm just playing the game. If I'm racing or doing anything else where I have to be remotely consistent and or there's like an ounce of E-Road, yeah, we're not running the Beta. However, for qualifying, this bike is insane. It's super fast, and it seems to just push through rhythms really, really well. And I think that has a lot to do with just how stiff the front end of this bike is. It doesn't ever collapse on you. For tires, right now I'm running 120, like I said earlier. Sometimes I'll go around to 110 and kind of drop around. But for now, I'm on the 120. Under suspension, you can see that I stiffen the absolute bejeebie weebies out of the front end here. It is extremely stiff, and I really like it. Now, I will say that there's a very specific technique through the whoops on this bike where you cannot shift up to 4th or 5th like you would on an Austrian bike. Personally, if it's a short whoop section, like for instance, the whoop section on San Diego, there are times, especially when their E-Road kicks in even a little bit, that I won't even shift out of 2nd. And I know people are going to be like, what, Doc, that's impossible. It's not. It works fine, but most of the time I'm only going up into 3rd gear, and you really have to make sure that you don't wheelie going into the whoops at all. Like, all of your weight has to be completely level or forward when you go into the whoops, but not too far forward, because if you get it too far forward, the front end will bounce up and you will wheelie through the whoops. This bike is very like high risk, high reward in my opinion. Like, it's a very skilled bike where it's gonna fall apart if your technique isn't good, especially through whoops or E-Road. I mean, it's just really bad in E-Road. It does like to wheelie the whoops, and if you can figure out how to not wheelie the whoops consistently, or to master the wheelie where you can just skills them and wheel tap all of them. But yeah, you can see the front end's really stiff, the rear end's pretty soft. Personally, I think it rips. and it's really good everywhere else. It's really fast. You can see I made some gearing changes here. I actually made my second gear hit even harder than it already does. I personally really like that. And I made my third gear a bit longer because, well, like I said earlier, I'm only going through the whoops in third gear anyway, so I need to have a little bit more like speed going through them, if you will. And then not a ton of changes under geometry, but yeah, obviously make sure you're running race mapping because this thing's an absolute missile. Hands down, my favorite bike in the game for qualifying. Once it comes to racing, probably going on the KTM. But if you don't like the KTM and you want to run something different, I actually really like the Husky. The Husky is one of my favorite bikes when it comes to a track that I need it to be really agile on. For instance, San Diego, I did run the Husky because there was a lot of turns, you know, it's very turny-worny. I ran the Husky, it seemed to do good. I didn't make it to the mains, but that's because my start sucked. But we're running the 120 rear tire on this thing. It turns so good that sometimes I think the 110, I am turning too good and it slides out, or I, you know, oversteer or something. So we run the 120 to kind of balance things out. Under suspension, honestly, not a ton of changes. I like this bike pretty soft and it seems to work for me well. Like it seems to be just as good as the KTM through the whoops, but in a different way. It can start to teeter sometimes, but personally, I've found that it comes down to whether I'm executing my technique through the whoops or not. Everyone has a little bit different of a technique, and so maybe this setup won't work for you, but it seems to work just fine for me. Under drivetrain, a couple changes. I made my second gear hit a little bit harder because I feel like the Husky's a little on the sluggish side, so kind of helped give it a little bit more oomph. And then I made my fourth gear longer. I seem to do that on all the bikes. Whatever gear I'm going to go through whoops on, I seem to just crank up, make it a little bit longer. It helps keep it a little bit more stable. On the KTM and the Husky, I'm definitely double upshifting, sometimes triple upshifting into fifth, but I found I'm more consistent just going from second out of a corner into fourth. But you know, maybe you like going into fifth. I know Linz likes going into fifth, and a lot of the top guys do, but I found fourth seems to be fine. Not a ton of changes under geometry. The Husky by itself is actually pretty solid. If you think the bike's turning too much or like oversteering for you, turn your swing arm length up. That should help a little bit. And then of course, race mapping. Anyway, boys, those are my 3 favorite 450 setups and MX bikes right now. I'll see if I can get to a Yamaha, and big shout out to Doug for basically providing all of these for free. You can just download his setups straight off of his Discord. They're amazing. And this isn't like sponsor or anything. He actually has no idea I'm making this video, but they're very, very good. And you should definitely check his setups out. Anyway, I love you and I'll see you in the next one. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if this was helpful. Peace.